Okay, today's shir, we'll talk about a chiddush of the Rav, Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. I read it in the book Kedushas Aviv from his son-in-law, Reb Aaron Lichtenstein, and it's about the Kedushas Yerushalayim. Of course, it's very appropriate now in the 9 days to sort of bring the consciousness, at least some halachic consciousness as well. There will be a point, actually, that is not just halachic, but is a bit more than that. So let's go straight to the share screen. Okay. Okay. So we're in the Rambam and the laws of the Beis HaMikdash, and we're at that point in the Rambam where he describes how, in order to add to the boundaries of Yerushalayim, that it should be kadosh for eating Maser Sheni, Kodeshim Kalim, all the laws of the holiness of the city, and to expand maybe a new wall. Okay, there is a ceremony with many components. All right, and some of it was actually mentioned in the book of Ezra, where they actually conducted such a ceremony when they wanted to reestablish the actual boundaries of the city. So the Rambam says, any place that does not have everything that I have mentioned in the past, all the elements, okay, and in the order that the ceremony must proceed in the proper order, ein kiddush gomel. It turns out that when you'll add to the city, it will not be a genuine kiddush, consecration, to make that include that as part of the holy city. And that which is mentioned about Ezra, that he actually performed such a ceremony, zikaron hu she'asa. It was only to evoke the original ceremony when Yerushalayim was already consecrated back in the days of Shlomo. His actions did not make the place holy because it couldn't. There certainly was no king in Israel in the second Beis HaMikdash. Certainly when Ezra came back, we were under Cyrus when he came back. And the Gemara in Maseches Yoma says that there was no Urim V'Tumim in the second temple. Ubamenes Kacha, so how indeed, after the destruction, how indeed did the city become the holy city for all the laws? B'kedusha Rishona Shekidshah Shlomo. Why? Shehu Kidesh Hu Azara V'Yerushalayim. He consecrated the courtyard of the Beis HaMikdash, in which they brought all the korbanos, etc. V'Yerushalayim, and the city for all of its laws. L'sha'atan, while his building was there. V'kitchen liyasid lavo, independent of whatever circumstances will happen to the Beis HaMikdash, the holiness of the place is still there. Lefichach makrivin hakarbanos kulan. It's possible, afal pi she'ein sham bayis banui. Now that the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, it is possible to bring a korban, even though there is no structure. If you know the spot of the Mizbeach and you build the Mizbeach, you can bring a korban. And indeed, if you know the boundaries of the Azara, ochlim kodashei kodashim b'chol ha'azara afal pi shehi charevo ve'eno mukeves b'mechitza, and it doesn't even have like a curtains around it. It's wide open. But if you stay within the boundaries that were originally by Shlomo, you're good. V'yochlim kodashim kalim ha'maser sheni b'chol Yerushalayim afal pi she'en sham chamos. It took 20 years. In the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, I think it took 20 years until they finally built the walls of Yerushalayim. But you could still, once you had a Mizbeach, you could bring Kodeshim Kalim, a Shlamim, for example, or you brought Maser Sheni, They were chayav in Masros when they came back. So you can eat it in all of Yerushalayim. Why? Shehakadusha Rishona Kitchel Sha'ato, the Kitchel Yasid Lovo. The original Kedusha of Yerushalayim was forever. V'lama ani omer b'mikdash Yerushalayim. Kedusha Rishona Kitchel Sha'ato, the Kitchel Yasid Lovo. Why do I say that? In contrast, with Kedushas Eretz Yisrael in Yon Shviz Umasros, v'chayotze behen lo kitcholos lovo. Namely, in the laws of what stuff that grows out of the ground, that you Shvius, the laws of Shemitah and Yovel and Masros, the truma and the tithes that you have to give, we don't say lo kitcholos lovo. We say that when the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, those laws fell away. Those laws fell away at the time. Why? Lefi, one side of the coin is Lefi shekedushas hamikdash v'Yerushalayim ipnei hashchina u'shchina hena b'Tayla. The kedusha, the sanctity, the holiness of the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, in their varying degrees, is for the divine presence, and the divine presence has never genuinely left. V'harehu omer. Thus, this week, this is certainly high in our consciousness. Normally, how would you read it? Places that were holy places will be destroyed. It says nothing about their current status. However, Chazal didn't read it that way. They're still called Mikdashechem. That's what Chazal understands. All right, that's one side of the coin. That it's kedusha, it's kedusha is leolam, it's forever. When the Jews came into Eretz Yisrael in the days of Yehoshua, how did they become obligated in what we call mitzvos hatluyos ba'aretz? The giving the tithes, all the agricultural produce that we've studied for about 4 or 5 weeks until now. That's because they simply conquered the country. The whole nation as a whole conquered the country. And once, therefore, it was conquered by others, Batel HaKibush, the original entry into the land, is gone. Whoa, that's very strong language. There's no Eretz Yisrael. Once the place is destroyed, is conquered by others, by Assyrians in the north, Babylonians ultimately, it's not ours. And therefore, there's no mitzvah there. Just because you happen to be there at the time, there's no Eretz Yisrael. Einam and Eretz Yisrael. Such a strong statement. So when Ezra came back the second time in the Shivat Zion under the permission of Koresh, he came out, I think, under Artaxashta, but originally it was Koresh. Okay. They did not take it by conquest, rather by possession, almost squatters' rights. They're not squatters because they were given permission by Cyrus the Great to go back and take it. And the country had not been occupied by others. No one else came into the country. They went back to the places from which they came. That being the case, he says, wherever they came back, that chazaka lasts forever, is for today. Even though we've lost the country, others have invaded it and taken it. And nonetheless, chayav b'shviyus u'b'masros al haderech shabiyalnu b'hilchos truma. By the way, he does not say we are obligated in shviyus and masros the way we explained in hilchos truma, as though it's obvious that it's a chiyuv min Torah. No, it's al haderech. It happens to be only a chiyuv min Rabbanan. It's only a rabbinic, according to the Ram. That's a Rambam's opinion. Okay, that's that little phrase al haderech, because there is another wrinkle in the law that prevents it from being Midiaraisa, from being Manat Torah. Okay, at first sounds unbelievably counterintuitive. Here we come in, here God leads Jewish people into Eretz Yisrael under Yehoshua, Nisim ben Flos, Hakol, and as soon as they're kicked out, Ois Eretz Yisrael, there's no Eretz Yisrael. How can it be? Okay. And now we come in quietly. Hardly anybody returns. Such a pitifully small proportion. A little over 40,000 people returned to Eretz Yisrael. It only grew much later, but when they came back, it was hardly anybody. The chazaka that they made is a chazaka forever. Forever. It's so counterintuitive. Thought about it. I mean, there are loads of explanations for it, but Lichtenstein gives one as well. I'm not 100% convinced that it's in the language of the Rambam here and in Hilchos Trumas where he repeats this point again. Okay. I look at it very prosaically, not, very prosaically. If you take something by force, by conquest, even under God, God says I give it to you, but you take it by conquest. In human terms, a conquest is never agreed to. The people that are pushed out want to come back. So your hold on the land always depends on your defending the land. I mean, a very prosaic, streetwise sense. You have it. Yes, God promised it. God promised you will keep it. You will only keep it if you keep God's ways, which we did not, which we failed. Okay. But the possession was by force. So that means no one ever admitted that it was yours. That means anybody that wants to come back and take it says it's not yours. I mean, that issue, of course, oddly enough, is in the first Rashi in the Chumash. Okay. But in Chazaka, what happened? The land was basically desolate. They came back under the permission of Koresh. Cyrus the Great is the ruler of the world. When they walk in and he gives them permission, and when they take it, they make the chazaka and they work the land, they live on it. It's now theirs, agreed to by everybody. Cyrus is everybody at this point. There are no contestants to their possession at the time that they take it. There are no contestants to their possession of the land. Therefore, even though they're kicked out later, they are still at a street level. They're still the owners of the land, and their claim is still valid. That's how I understand it. It's not how shall I say it? It's not spiritually very satisfying. Agreed. Okay. And in terms of the history and the Tanakh and all the categories that we bring to understanding these stories, it is totally counterintuitive. And the great difficulty is that this seems to be, from what I can tell, this seems to be the Rambam's own chiddush completely. Okay, so that's already a problem. But the key lesson we will have here is that the key lesson that we will have here is that the kedusha space of mikdash is forever, and the kedusha of the shviyas and all of that, there is a distinction. One is kedusha l'shat of a kid shaliasad lovo, and the other is what is low kid shaliasad lovo. Okay. All right. Now we'll study another mishnah in which there will be an obvious question. But from what we understand in the Rambam, the Rav says that it's very, very clear as to how to understand the Mishnah through the lens of the halacha as expressed in the Rambam. Okay, and we'll see that we'll give an application where you see very explicitly what this law is. Okay. This is the Mishnah in Kalim, and the Mishnah in Kalim describes 10 levels of Kedusha. And the levels of Kedusha are described by the laws that are appropriate to them. That's already an interesting point. Totally on its own. There's no theological discussion. There's a different kind of discussion. I'll make a comment about it later. Okay. Esa Kedusha saying. Eretz Yisrael mekudeshes mikol ha'aratzos. Eretz Yisrael is holier than others. Umahi kedusha. So how does it express itself? Shemevin mimena ha'omer v'habikurim u'shtei halechem. That you bring from the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, you bring the Korban Omer on the second day Pesach. You bring Bikurim, as we spoke. Those are the first ripe fruits, the first ripe stalks or whatever. Okay, Ushtei Halechem are the two loaves that are brought on Shavuot. What's the difference between the Omer and the Shtei Halechem? Omer comes from barley, and that allows everyone to eat from the new crop of grain. Okay, Shtei Halechem comes from wheat. That's brought on Shavuos, and that allows the new crop of grain to be used in the Beis Hamikdash for all the menachot, for the flour also. Okay. Masha'e Mevian came in Kol Ha'aretzos. You don't bring those things from another country. Ayaros Hamukofos Chomo, cities that are surrounded by a wall, Bekudashos Mimena, are holier. Shemashalchim mitzam mitochanes hamitzora in. That you have to send a mitzora out of a city that has a walled city, okay, or any walled city. An open city, he does not really have to leave. And if he comes in, there is no transgression. In the case of in the case of Yerushalayim, according to the Rambam, in the case of Yerushalayim, he's over a lav if he comes into the precincts of Yerushalayim, okay? But in a walled city, not Yerushalayim, he's over on the Naseh. But he has to leave. Of course, we know about walled cities in two laws. This one about the Mitzorah, that's discussed in Parshas Nosson. Okay. And the second law is about Din Batei Orechoma, that's discussed in Bahar. When you're selling real estate, all sales of real estate are temporary and usually go back at Yovel. Those are the open fields. But a house inside a walled city, okay, the original owner has 1 year to redeem it. And if not, it's lost forever. That's the only case. It's not mentioned here, okay? We'll make note of that later. And there's a law midrabanan that the Mishnah refers to. Umisababin l'sochan meis ad sheyirtzu. If a person dies, it's not clear to me if you're allowed to bury him in the city or not. But apparently, at the very least, you can take him from one place to another in case there are different places to give hespedim, for example. It's possible. But the second yatsu, the body leaves the city, it does not come back because of the tumor. It does not come back into the city, and that's a din d'Rabbanan. That's not a d'Oraisa. Okay. Now we come to the city. So we have Eretz Yisrael. We have the special cities that are surrounded by walls, and now we're talking about the wall, the wall around Yerushalayim. Lifnimen hachama mekudash mehem. Shochlim kam kodashim kalimu maaser sheni. All right, you can eat. Of course, you say Ezehu Makom every morning, right? And you actually pay attention, so you know that you eat kodashim kalim b'chol ho'ir in the full city, so that's inside the walls. And maaser sheni. That's the whole point of maaser sheni, as we discussed last week. Har Habayis is the actual base precinct, temple precinct in English, right? The whole section for the whole Beis Hamikdash. Mekudash b'menu. She'ein zavim v'zavos nidos v'yoldos nichnasim l'sham. This refers to tuma yotzei megufo. Tuma that is a result of coming out of a person. Azav, they call it a gonorrhea, but it's not a gonorrhea from virulent. It's not a virulent gonorrhea from sexual activity. Okay, it's in sexual transmission. There's somehow a certain type of mucus is always just being secreted from the urethra. Okay, Zava is a woman bleeding outside of a menstrual cycle and it continues for too long. Nidos is the menstrual cycle. Yoldos, Yoledes always has a period of tuma, okay, Tara, then tuma, and then she has to bring a korban. All of these. It turns out while they're in their state of Tuma, they do not come in. All right. And then Hachel Mekudash Mimeno. Hachel was an enclosure around the building of the Beis Hamikdash. There's the wall around the whole compound, and then there is a second wall inside, which and 10 amos in from that wall is the actual structure of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay. Namely that non-Jews and nor a tamei meis, okay, do not go in there. Okay, if you notice, it turns out that there is increasing tumah. In the Naso it says Vishalchu men hamachane kol tzarua v'zav v'tamei lanefesh. So the tzarua is thought of as the most tamei, and he's pushed out the furthest from Machane Yisrael, from the encampment. And then the Zav is for all of these where we have Tuma Yotzei Migufo. They can come further in. They come into the city, of course, but they don't come onto the Harabayas. The Tomei Meis can come onto the Harabayas, but he cannot come in inside the Chayil. Okay. It also says Ein Ovdei Kochavim Sham. It turns out that there's still two of them. I think there are two of them. One is complete and one is not. There are two stels that steles, I forget how to pronounce it, that used to be in the Rockefeller Museum, that they have the original things from the Beis Hamikdash. You know, real do not enter sign. Yeah, in Greek. It's in Greek. Okay. It was there in Greek. Right, so it was there. Okay. Next, further in. Now we're sort of pretty much now we're getting into the building. Ezras Noshim Mekudeshes Mimenu. She'ein Tvul Yom Nichnas L'Sham. That's one step in. The Ezras Noshim. Tvul Yom is a person. You always hear it when we read the Torah. Person is Tamei Ubo B'Mayim, right? And then V'Tamei Ad Ha'ara V'Toher. So Tvul Yom is a person has gone into the mikveh to remove the tumah from whatever source, tumat sheres, tumas meis, any one of these that we discussed, and then one has to wait for the evening. So the Tvul Yom is between when he goes to the mikveh and when the evening, because this Tvul is in the day. V'yein chayav aleha chatas, but if a Tvul Yom came into the Ezras Noshim, there was no chatas. There was no formal transgression of a law. Ezras Yisrael, now we're already inside the main courtyard where we are bringing korbanos. And there are 11 amos. An amo is, well, according to Reb Moshe, is 1.5 feet, and according to Chazonis is about 2 feet. Okay, so there are 11 amos into the Beis Hamikdash. Ezras Yisrael mekudeshes mimeno. She'ein mechusar kippurim nechnasim l'sham. Mechusar kippurim is in these cases of zav, zava, dida, zav, zava, and yoledes, right? There's a korban, and a metzora. There's a korban. So they come into the Ezras Noshim, and they stand in the opening while whatever is going on in the Ezras Yisrael. Okay, but they don't step in until they are mechusar kippurim. They've gone to the mikveh. They had erev shemesh, sunset. The next day they're bringing the korban. Until they bring the korban, they're called mechusar kippurim. So they do not step into the Ezras Yisrael. V'chayevan aleha chatas. Now, such a tamei in any of these categories that we mentioned, if they step in, then already one is transgressed. One has transgressed the formal law. Okay. Ezras Kohanim Mekudeshes Mimeno. Now we're 11 amos in, and now we're around the Mizbeach and then the main courtyard further in. That's even holier. She'ein Yisrael nechnasim l'sham. Elo b'shas tzarchem l'smicha l'shchita v'l'tenufa. Namely, the ordinary Yisrael who is completely tahor only goes further in than those 11 when the person has to do something appropriate associated with the korban. Smicha, putting one's hands on the korban, A non-Kohen is allowed to slaughter a korban. So if this person is going to do it, he's in there. And tenufa is in certain korbanos, you take part of it and you lift it up with the Kohen. So then the Israel is inside there, and then as soon as he finishes, he steps back. Okay. Okay, what's the next level? Now we're in the true interior. Oh, no, not yet. Not yet. We're approaching the interior. We're now between Ben Ha'ulam V'Lam Mizbeach. Now, the Mizbeach is in the center of the court, and then we're about to go towards the entry to the Heichel. The Ulam is like an is like a tremendous antechamber to the Heichel. It's built into the wall. Okay. So Ben Ha'ulam V'Lam Mizbeach Mekudash Mimenu. She'en ba'alei mumim u'purei rosh nechasim l'sham. A Kohen who is a Baal Mum can still enter the Azara where Kohanim are for a purpose, okay? It doesn't take a stroll there, all right? But he never gets in between the Mizbeach and the entry to the Heichel, okay, to the inner chamber, all right? Pruei Rosh, I just looked it up quickly. It seems to be people who sort of men who grew their hair just simply wildly long. I'm not sure. I don't really know. When I read it, reminded me of the 70s. What can I say? Okay. Now we're inside, lifnim, inside, in the actual entry. You have to wash your hands from the kior in order to be able to step into there. To do an avoda, you have to do it. But here, simply to walk in. It doesn't even say that they're going to do anything. If they're inside the Ohel Moed, the Heichel, all right, what's in the Heichel? The Heichel outside in the Azara is the altar on which you bring all the korbanot. Inside the Heichel is Mizbach HaKtoras, where you bring the incense. That's at the center of the room. To the right is the table for lechem hapanim, the shulchan for lechem hapanim, for the bread, for the show bread. And on the left is the menorah that was lit every single day. Okay. All right. So you can't come in there. Finally, the holiest of all, the Kodesh HaKadoshim Kudash Mehem She'en Nechnas L'Shem El HaKohen Gadol B'Yom HaKippurim B'Shas Ha'avodah. Okay, these are all the gradations of Kedusha. Okay, except for the first one. I mean, it's an important comment to make, although I'm going to talk strictly halachically in a moment. But maybe it's an important comment to make. You notice that Kedusha here is completely defined by restraint, by reticence, by where one cannot approach. Okay. The limits of where one can. Except for the Omer Bikurim Shtei Alechem and eating Kodesh and Kalim and Maaser Sheni, all the rest are restrictions, and that defines Kedusha. Part of the Churban Abayis is brought with us, and we feel it very keenly today, all right, in our current culture. This sense of restraint, of respect, of domains, of facts that are bigger than one's self, that's kind of lost in our culture, completely lost. And here you see such a detailed, articulate expression of what it is in the Zman Habayis. Okay, I'll leave it at that. That's my Drush for Tisha B'Av. Leave it at that. Okay. All right. Now let's get back to the halacha. The Rav asks, there's an obvious thing missing from here. What is obviously missing is Trumos HaMasros. If you're bringing the Omer, Bikurim, and Shtei Halechem, what happened to Truma and Maser? Okay. On one point, Maser Sheni is mentioned also, but what about the others? So the Rav gives the following answer, and it really was already expressed in the Rambam we read, And we'll find a new expression of it in the Rambam that's coming. It's a very beautiful Kiddush. He says all of these laws are really the Kedushas HaMikdash. They're all the Kedusha that emanates from the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and it sort of emanates throughout the whole country. And the further out that it emanates, of course, its effect is lessened. That's how he envisions it, okay? And what makes it what it is the divine presence, the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah never leaves, okay? Truma and Maser doesn't have to do so much with the Beis Hamikdash. Truma Maser is the karka, the dirt of Eretz Yisrael. We come in, we take possession of the land, we live in it, okay, and we get it, and we work the land and receive its yield. Well, we have to express the fact that the yield is not exclusively ours; it belongs to God. So then there's Truma, Maser, Shemitah, Yovel. All of these are called, the Rav calls it, are all Chovas Karka. And actually that phrase is from the Vilna Gaon. As good Rabbi Lichtenstein quotes, maybe that's how he heard it even from the Rav, that the Vilna Gaon took out the word Bikurim. Because he thought that Bikurim was Chovas Karka like everything else. Okay, if you're taking out Bikurim, maybe you should take out Maser Sheni as well. Okay? You understand? All right? So the Vilna Gaon, and he called it. He says Trumas and Masros. You don't have to what he says. Bikurim is Chovas Karka. So that already implies that it's obvious that Truma and Maser is out because that's Chovas Karka. So that just comes from the land, the dirt of Eretz Yisrael. Okay, an important distinction. Okay, and it shows up very clearly. Okay, the first thing is why Bikurim and why Maser Sheni, and not the other Chovas Karka? Because Bikurim and Maser Sheni have to do with Kedushas HaMikdash. They have to do with the holiness of the Mikdash. Namely, Bikurim, the first fruits are brought into the Beis HaMikdash. They're put by the Mizbeach, and a person puts them down, right? And then reads the Mikra Bikurim, the statement of what we say in the Haggadah, really. Okay, it's that short history of coming to Eretz Yisrael from coming down to Egypt. All right, and now I bring my first fruits. So it's mamish. It's the Beis Hamikdash. So Bikurim belongs there, and Maser Sheni belongs there because Maser Sheni, one, celebrates God's gift by eating that material in front of God in Yerushalayim. Okay, so in that sense, those two examples are indeed Kedushas Mikdash. They really come from the Mikdash. Or you might say they partake of both. Chovas Karka, they come from working the land, but they are given new expression, an additional expression surrounding the Beis HaMikdash. The usual Truma, Maser Rishon, Maser Ani, Shemitah, Yovel has nothing to do with the Beis HaMikdash. It has to do with people being in Eretz Yisrael. Has to do with people in Eretz Yisrael. As we certainly read, that when they came into Eretz Yisrael in the days of Yehoshua, 14 years, after 14 years, they started doing Truma and Maser, and it's over 400, and Shemitah and Yovel, and it's over 400 years after that till they have a Beis HaMikdash. So that's Chovas Karka and the Kedushas HaMikdash. And indeed, the language that we read in the Rambam before makes that very clear. He says the Kedushas Beis HaMikdash is the presence of the Shekhinah, and it is there forever. And the Kedushas of Eretz Yisrael is another category, okay? And then he says why there's a distinction between the first and second period. That I'm not going to explain in this slide, no. The issue is merely the conceptual distinction between Kedushas HaMikdash and Kedushas Eretz Yisrael. Okay. And now here's where the distinction shows up. Distinction shows up. We'll give away the punchline, which I think this This is sort of almost a proof for the Rav's conceptual explanation of the difference between the two cases, and his explanation of the Mishnah. All of this is about Kedushas HaMikdash, the holiness that emanates from Kodesh HaKadoshim, from the Holy of Holies, because of the Shekhinah, and it permeates out to all of Eretz Yisrael in varying stages. Okay. Take a look. Ayoros HaMukofos Chomo, Shemashalchen Mitochenes HaMetzoroim. Okay. We send the Metzoroim out of there. Now, when you talk about Orei Choma, you talk about Kiddush, you have to consecrate the city for the houses. There are two things. They're the houses. The issue of selling a house in an Orei Choma in the period of Yovel, you have to redeem it. If you buy it, if you sell it, you have to redeem it within the year, although it's lost forever. That is not mentioned here. Okay? That is not mentioned here. And it turns out that law depends on Yovel. If there's no Yovel, there's no law of this business of a house inside a walled city. But it's quite possible that there still remains the law of the Mitzvah. You'll see in a second. I'll read the Rambam. You'll see that the language can pick it up. Okay. All right. So let's go a little further. All right. And now we'll go back to the Rambam. The Rambam tells us something new that some people know. Yitzchak mentioned it a couple of weeks ago when we first started talking about this. The Rambam now is talking about Shemitah and Yovel, okay? And he's gone through the whole calculation, how to do the calculation of what we do today. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it. We ought to talk a little about Shemitah and Yovel. It's coming up this coming year. And he says as follows: Mishagalosh Shevet Reuven v'Shevet Gad v'Chatzi Shevet HaManashe. When these are the tribes that stayed in the Golan, right? We just read it last week in Parshas Matos, right? Yeah, Parshas Matos. That they stayed in the Golan. They helped the Jews conquer Eretz Yisrael west of the Yarden, but they went back. When they went into Galus, the law is, Rambam is quoting a brisa, Batlu hayovlos. There was no more Yovel. Why? Shenema rekrosem dror ba'oretz l'chol yoshveha. Bizman shekol yoshveha aleha. You have to have the whole body politic in Eretz Yisrael in order to have Yovel. You should proclaim freedom through the land to all its inhabitants. The brisa says, you have to have all the inhabitants there, namely the full Jewish people. Not only that, it even says something stronger. The law requires that the area allotted to Yehuda, everybody from Yehuda is in that area allotted, and the area allotted to Asher, everybody from Asher is in there. They're not mixed around. Okay. So that means, the Rambam is quietly just simply saying that from the time, this is the first Golus in the early stages. This is not the Golus of Nebuchadnezzar. This is before. This is part of the first stages of Golus Malchus Yisrael. Okay, that they went into Golus, and that means at the end of the second Beis Hamikdash, the Yovel of the first Beis Hamikdash, excuse me, is before Golus Baba. In the last years of the Beis Hamikdash, there was no Yovel, according to the brisa. And Kal Vachomer and the second Beis Hamikdash, when only such a small part of the Jewish people came back, there was also no Yovel. Okay. And now the Rambam wants to conclude this part of the discussion. Bisman shehayovel noheg ba'aretz, noheg b'chutz la'aretz. Well, which fact of Yovel applies outside of Eretz Yisrael? That would be the law of Eved Ivri. If a person has an Eved Ivri who's an Irtza, and whether he bought him out, he might, I don't know if you can buy him outside Eretz Yisrael, but certainly he bought him in Eretz Yisrael and he left Eretz Yisrael, moved to another country. The guy is still with him. Yovel comes, he has to let him out. Okay. B'zman she'Yovel noheg b'chutz la'aretz, I'm sorry. Yeah, noheg b'chutz la'aretz. Shenema Yovel hi b'chol makom. Ben b'fnei hamayis, ben shelo b'fnei hamayis. Why did they have to say Yovel hi? Namely, crossing ba'aretz, drawer ba'aretz l'chol yoshveho. Yovel hi tihi alachem. Why does the Torah have to go back and repeat it? Because you might think for the word ba'aretz, it's only in Eretz Yisrael. So they say it's b'chol makom. All right, now we come to our actual controversial piece of Rambam. Okay. All right. Let's, in fact, to make it clearer, let's look at the Ksav Yad version. All right. Bezman Yovel Noheg. Okay. He now says as follows. Bezman Yovel Noheg. Noheg din evet ivri. Okay. The din batei arechama. This is my point. He doesn't say din arechama, which would include shiluach mitzorim, sending the lepers out. He says din batei arechama. Only that law. The law of Shiluach Mitzoreim is independent of Yovel. And as we said before, it comes from Kedushas HaMikdash, as we described in the Mishnah in Kalim, predicated on how the Rav explained the Mishnah. That because it's Kedushas HaMikdash, that's only Shiluach Mitzoreim. But Botei Orechoma is part of the laws of Yovel. That's Chovas Karka. That has to come from the law of the Karka. And you have Vidin Sedei Charamim. Sedei Charamim is one dedicates a field to the Beis HaMikdash. And what are the laws of the possibilities of redeeming it? Vidin Sedei Achuza. That's when you sell your own agriculture, your own farmland, and you could have the opportunity of buying it back at any period between now and Yovel on a prorated number of years that were left to Yovel. Okay. Mekabel Ger Toshav, and you expect a Ger Toshav. A Ger Toshav is a person who accepts the 7 mitzvahs of Bnei Noach. Okay. V'nohega shviyas ba'aretz, v'ashmatas ksafim b'chol makom min haTorah. And you have, if Yovel is enforced, automatically Shemitah is enforced, and the law of canceling of debts at the end of Shemitah, that's everywhere in HaTorah. However, Bisman she'ein hayovel noheg, eno noheg evet ivri, v'lo batei arechoma, v'lo sedei achuza, v'lo sedei charamim, ve'ein mekablim ger toshav, v'noheg shviyas ba'aretz midivreihem. If there's no Yovel, the Rambam Paskins, there's no Shemitah min HaTorah. It's only midrabanan. V'chen hashmatas ksafim b'chol makom is midivreihem. If there is, when you have Shemitah's Ksafim at the end of Shemitah, and you write a prismal and all of that, that whole thing is midrabanan. Okay, so this is what I'm saying. That since and it's all, what are we talking about? We're talking about the law of Batei Arechama as dependent on Yovel. But the law of Shiluach Mitzoraim apparently does not depend on Yovel, and that depends on Kedushas HaMikdash. And the Kedushas HaMikdash never leaves. Never. Okay, it turns out that this Nohega Shviyas Ba'aretz Midivreihem turns out that is like a bombshell. Why? Because this is a manuscript that people did not know about. Okay? The Korkus, Rabbi Yosef Korkus, was one of the Magorashei Sfarad. He's one of the Sfarad exiles from Spain in 1490, expulsion in 1492, along with the Radbaz. I'm not sure if the Yosef Karo was, but he was certainly part of that culture. Okay? I have to get that for the moment. All right. So they were all in the same time, and they wrote most of them wrote the basic commentaries we have on the Rambam, except for one, the Maggid Mishnah, which was earlier. Okay, he had this version in the Ksav Yad. And here's what happened. When they started printing the Ksav Yad, You see, the Rambam says, Bisman she'en hayovel honoheg. He starts going through the whole list, one by one, by one, by one, by one. Okay, look what the printers did. Ubisman she'en hayovel noheg. Eino noheg el chad mikol elu. He doesn't bother the printers, just simply collapse the whole thing, not to run through the whole thing. Okay. Chutz, except for mishvius ba'aretz, v'ashmatas ksafim b'chol makom b'divreihem k'moshe b'yarnu. Now you just read explicitly that the manuscript said that shvius ba'aretz, shmita in Eretz Yisrael is midrabanan, right? That means that this word midivreihem, right? Shvius ba'aretz hashmatas ksafim b'chol makom, and then midivreihem applies to both. Okay. Well, it turns out that that's a it was a tremendous argument until the Frankel published this in their edition of the Mishnah Torah. It's a big argument whether the Rambam held that Shemitah Bisman Hazeh nowadays is Midiaraisa Midrabanan. Kesef Mishnah held it was Midiaraisa. I saw in the Achronim when they're talking about the Heter Mechira, the Yosameach thought that the Rambam held that it was Diaraisa. Rav Kook argued that it was Midrabanan. Okay, they're trying to, because of this vague phrase that can be read, Chutz mishvius ba'aretz is one thing, and Hashmatas ksafim b'chol makom b'divreim is the second thing. So they read that shvius ba'aretz is Midrabanan. Okay, and certainly the language that we read at the very beginning of the shir, the language that we read here, the kedusha shniya mekudash hayom v'afal pi v'chayav b'shvius u'b'masos al hader. Right? What does that sound like? That sounds like everything is minat Torah. Okay, in Hilchas Truma, he does not explicitly talk about shvius. He talks about maser. That's something else. Okay, but it certainly sounds as though we're talking about minat Torah. So people really interpreted for many years Shvius ba'aretz min haTorah v'ashmatas ksafim b'chol makom. I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong place. V'chein, where is it? Over here. Excuse me. Sorry, getting too excited here. Chutz mishvius ba'aretz is min haTorah v'ashmatas ksafim b'chol makom b'divreim. That's how people read it till the modern time. Okay. I had sort of got interested in this problem. I looked around. I kept asking people, do you know? And once I brought it up to Rabbi Linson, Rabbi Dov Linson. First thing he did, he dragged me over to the Frankel. He opened up the Frankel to the spot and said, so, now that they have the Chsav Yad, they know what he holds, that the opinion is midivrei. Okay, so it's a longer shir than usual. We covered some interesting stuff. I feel that all of this is appropriate for the period of the 3 weeks, the 9 days, and even afterwards, the Shiva de Nechemta, the periods of consolation, that we talk about, do some halacha associated with Eretz Yisrael. Okay, and then if we come to it by Chiddush from Rabbi Soloveitchik, one could do a lot worse, for sure, right? Okay, it's a gorgeous Chiddush, and I still want that it stays with you, that the overwhelming sense from the Mishnayos, from this Mishnah, is that Kedusha, and if you look carefully and you read the sources and you listen to the Kriyas Torah, okay, you will find that Kedusha always so much has to do with restraint. That not everything is for us. There is stuff with which we must come to at a higher level than we ordinary. And indeed, once you come to Ezra's Kohanim, we can do it. The Kohanim do it unless we have to go deal with the Korban, only the Kohanim, all right? Torahs can only be bought by a Kohen, right? There are even limits there. Okay? And even among the Kohanim, the Kohen Gadol can go into the Kodesh HaKadoshim once a year, okay? For the purpose of the Torahs and then sprinkling of the blood, okay? All right? It's an important point that this sense of restraint, of Kedusha is really low. But the Rambam assures us, of course, that the Shekhinah is there, even when it's Shamim, even when it's desolate. And that's how we sort of have to go in to the holiday of Tisha B'Av coming up right now. And then afterwards, the Shiva de Nechemta, the 7 weeks of consolation. Okay, that's it. We'll see you next week.